If you like what I do, consider joining my channel or donating to my coffee. Links in the description.
My baby, I tell you though, 'cause I'm feeling so good.
The legendary hero is back! Janosik 2!
Wait, you're telling me you've never heard of Janosik? The legendary Slavic highwayman? A key figure and national hero in Central European folklore? Yeah, I'm just messing with you. I've never heard of him either up until recently. Janosik is a big deal in Central European folklore, especially in Poland, the Czech Republic, and Slovakia. He's often compared to Robin Hood for stealing from the rich to give to the poor. But with a twist. Folk tales give Janosik superhuman strength and wild, almost mythical adventures. He's been the subject of movies, books, TV series, and now a video game franchise. And his latest game just dropped, Janosik 2. In Janosik 2, you play as the legendary Janosik, who gets captured by a man in a dress, as one does, and thrown into prison. With the help of his new werewolf pal Bogdan, Janosik must escape prison and rescue his bride Yanka from the corrupt Baron de Blonde. It's a silly premise, but Janosik 2 is a silly game. But is it a good Metroidvania?
Combat.
Combat's both simplistic and diverse in Janosik. There are no advanced mechanics to master like parrying or perfect dodges or anything like that. It's really back to the basics with Janosik. Hit enemies before they hit you, and don't touch them in the process. It feels very old school, which, if you couldn't tell by the game's visuals, is exactly what the game's going for. Each character, of which there are 4, has their own attacks, attack strengths, and ranges. I don't want to go over every character's every move, so it's suffice to say there's a lot of attacks and skills you have at your disposal. Each character has a standard attack and a ranged attack, and each attack is best suited for certain situations. For instance, spiders release harmful gas when they die, so slicing them up with Janosik's sword isn't the safest option. But using Bogdan's long-ranged repeater beater, yes, that's what it's called, is a much safer and effective approach. And switching between characters is as easy as a tap of a button, so it's no big deal to quickly switch from Janosik to Bogdan, unless you're really lazy. Then you can just shoot the spider with Janosik's gun. Most characters' secondary attacks are limited, so try not to be too lazy. There's much more to talk about in terms of character attacks and their ancillary uses, but I'm saving that for the next section. The last thing to really go over for combat are the bosses, and these bosses were pretty easy. I liked their designs a lot, but Janosik is just too powerful for them. Many of the game's weapons can be upgraded at shops, more on all of that in the progression section, and the upgraded gun with a full 64 bullet clip myrtleizes the game's early bosses. As for the later bosses, Janosik's sword's more than enough. When you hit an enemy, you gain iframes, meaning you can literally just stand inside of a boss and hack away until they die. And if a boss somehow happens to do damage to you, you can use a healing potion to bring yourself back up to full health. You gaining iframes from hitting bosses may be updated and patched out in the future, but this is how it was in the build I played, and I actually loved it. I'm not a huge combat dude when it comes to MVs. Not that I don't like combat, but it's just not like high priority for me. So this didn't bother me in Janosik, but for those looking for challenging bosses in combat, Janosik 2 might leave you wanting. But you honestly aren't playing Janosik for its combat, you're playing Janosik for its platforming. Speaking of which,
Abilities. Platforming.
there's a ton to talk about here, but I'll do my best to keep it brief, mainly for spoilers' sake, because finding all the characters' abilities is part of the fun. But yeah, there are a bunch of abilities in this game doled out between all 4 characters, and many of these abilities have uses both in combat and traversal. For instance, Janosik can throw his axe either at an enemy's head for damage, or at a wall to give himself a new platform to jump on. Bogdan has remote bombs that can explode enemies or clear paths, and Yanka gets a lantern that can initially only light the way, but can eventually be upgraded to set enemies on fire. And this is just the tip of the iceberg for all the abilities you get in Janosik. And that's not even including the double jump, which every character has from the start. Not that you get all 4 characters from the start, you know what I mean. Here's something cool. A lot of these abilities are missable, which can make the game far more challenging if you're not paying attention. For instance, Yanka's Lantern. I went through 2 pitch black levels before I discovered it. Not that it was tough to find, I'm just a dangerous mixture of dumb and impatient. And there are so many other upgrades and abilities you can miss if you don't find the NPC that gives you the ability and don't have the cash. Neither of these barriers should be too tough to overcome, but like I said, I'm dumb and impatient. I like this aspect of Janosik 2 a lot. There's something about missable upgrades that makes exploration that much more satisfying. But keep in mind, while abilities are missable, you can always backtrack to find stuff you missed. So, if you don't have the cash for something now, you can revisit the NPC later. As for the game's platforming, like I said earlier, this is why you play Janosik 2. The platforming is old school greatness and very much feels like a European developed platformer from the early to mid 90s. I'm talking Turrican, James Pond, Zool, the Great Gianna Sisters, which is from the late 80s, but close enough. Basically, levels are tight with lots of shit to collect. That's right, boys, we got ourselves a collectathon. Because Janosik is known for robbing from the rich and giving to the poor, it makes sense that he collects all these riches. Why these riches are scattered all over the place, I'll never know. Blame it on my made in the 80s brain, but I love collecting stuff while platforming. But you're not collecting all this stuff for points. This is cash money, baby. You're going to be spending what you collect, but more on that in the next section. Getting to platforming proper, this game is a platformer through and through. And it's a lot of fun. The game's levels are tightly designed, brimming with buttons, levers, traps, enemies, and of course, gold. Navigating these winding corridors, clever shortcuts, and trap-laden areas make exploration feel dynamic and rewarding, particularly when you stumble upon hidden caches of gold. And the wide variety of abilities at your disposal ensure getting to wherever you're going is never boring. Call me biased because of my upbringing, but the old school feel and design of Janosik's levels took me back. Running and jumping feels good, and there are some pretty challenging platforming sections as well. Thankfully, save points are plentiful, so you don't need to worry too much about the more difficult sections. And that'll do it for this section. What can I say? There are a ton of abilities in this game, and the platforming is perfect for anyone who misses that old school feel. But while the platforming is mostly smooth, some sections may feel repetitive if you're not a fan of collectathon style gameplay. However, the diversity in abilities keeps things fresh.
Progression.
Janosik is very much a Metroid-like on the Metroidvania spectrum. There's no leveling or skill trees or gear, but the gang can increase their HP by finding special heart icons during their adventure. And there are tons of other things that can be enhanced along the way, such as Janosik's sword damage, the amount of repeater beaters Bogdan can throw. We've been over this, that's what this weapon is actually called. And the amounts of ammo characters have for their secondary weapons. These upgrades are not only satisfying to unlock, but are also essential for tackling tougher enemies and platforming sections later in the game. The damage boost from Janosik's sword, for example, ensures quicker takedowns in heavy combat sections. Some of these enhancements are hidden behind tough platforming challenges, but most can be purchased at shops. Because I like collecting shiny things in video games, I personally had no issues with money. Players less inclined to grab every shiny thing might find themselves short on cash for essential upgrades, though even with my penchant to snag all things golden, I was still cutting it pretty close at the Swole Dude's shop. Thankfully, the game does a good job of scattering plenty of gold, so coming up short is rarely a problem. And that's it for progression. Thorough exploration pays off, as many upgrades are hidden in tricky areas that reward sharp eyes and platforming skills. Missing these could make some later sections tougher, so it's worth taking your time to uncover everything.
Exploration.
Exploration in Janosik 2 is interesting. Janosik's world's not constructed like your typical MV. Though it does technically have an interconnected world, its world doesn't feel organic. Essentially, Janosik's world is a big old hub town with a bunch of oddly placed doors that lead to the game's different levels, making it feel much more like a traditional platformer than a Metroidvania. But I assure you, Janosik 2 is an MV, but it'd best be described as a traditional platformer with Metroidvania elements, if you've ever heard of that old saying. So, you can't really break down Janosik 2 into biomes. Levels feel more like they have different skins rather than feeling like naturally occurring locations, if that makes sense. That being said, how would I describe Janosik 2's exploration? I'd say it's rewarding, but not in the way Metroidvanias are seeking. While exploring Janosik 2's levels, you'll be rewarded by collecting gold and opening shortcuts and finding secret areas. And let me tell you, there are a lot of false walls and secrets to discover. Each shortcut you unlock or hidden area you reveal feels like uncovering a small treasure, giving players a sense of accomplishment that fuels the desire to continue exploring. But where Metroidvaniers will find the most enjoyment is in rescuing prisoners. Prisoners are scattered all throughout Janosik's levels, and there are 150 in total. Most will be easily found by using the in-game map. Each level has a map players must find before they can use the in-game map. And just about everything you need to know about is automatically placed on the map for you, including alternate level exits. These alternate exits often require clever use of abilities or specific characters, encouraging players to think outside the box and return with new skills to unlock new paths. Alternate exits are where you're going to find hidden prisoners and upgrades that can't be purchased at the shop, and single-handedly validates Janosik 2 as a Metroidvania, because in order to get the game's best ending, you must backtrack to save these prisoners. Thankfully, the in-game map does a good job of pointing out points of interest, making backtracking to rescue prisoners less of a chore and more of a satisfying treasure hunt. And though, technically, backtracking isn't necessary to label something as a Metroidvania, it sure does help. And that's it for exploration. While Janosik 2 may lean more toward traditional platforming, its exploration mechanics, filled with hidden rooms, rewarding secrets, and the prisoner rescue loop, still deliver an engaging and enjoyable experience, even if it doesn't fully scratch the Metroidvania itch.
Atmosphere, narrative.
As stated in the introduction, Janosik 2 is a silly game. The dialogue is silly, some of the fights are silly, most of the cutscenes are silly. This game is just straight up silly, and I love it for that. I especially loved its voice acting. I don't know who's responsible for the sailors or the prisoners' voices, but you deserve an Oscar. I cracked up every time they spoke.
Get him up. One hold.
Janosik 2's presentation might not be for everyone, but I like the game's cutscenes. I don't know how to describe them, but they look like they were made in MS Paint, and their animations looked like a weird mixture of early 2000s Flash game and early childhood programming. It was an interesting vibe that I dug. And of course, I loved the pixel work. Sprites were chunky, and the environments were pretty dang good. Again, I'm from the old school, so games with this look and feel are right up my alley. And the game's music. There's not a lot of tracks, but the game's main track was actually kinda catchy. It was a playful and adventurous vibe that fits the game's tone. It's still playing in my head as I write this script. There's not much to say about the narrative that I didn't already cover in the intro. The game's not that deep, but its lighthearted and straightforward nature complements its tone's playfulness. There are 3 endings to discover, and you know I love multiple endings. And that'll do it for this section. With its nostalgic visuals, quirky humor, and lighthearted charm, Janosik 2 delivers a delightful experience that leans into its silliness and succeeds in creating a memorable old-school adventure.
Final thoughts and score.
Janosik 2 is a love letter to classic European platformers wrapped in a Metroidvania light package. It's brimming with charm, from its quirky voice acting and cheesy cutscenes to its nostalgic pixel art and lighthearted tone. While combat may lack depth, the game excels in delivering satisfying platforming, rewarding secrets, and a steady flow of upgrades that keep things engaging. I award Janosik 2 a 7.5 out of 10. Janosik 2 is available on PC for $8.99. You can also check out Janosik 2 Prologue, a 2 to 3 hour standalone story, absolutely free, as well as the first Janosik game, also absolutely free. I played Janosik 2 entirely on my Steam Deck with 0 issues, and thus give the game a Steam Deck rating of verified.
Pair placement.
Janosik 2 is a solid game with enjoyable mechanics and a unique vibe. Its charm and accessibility make it a worthwhile experience for fans of retro platformers and lighthearted adventures. From a Metroidvania perspective, exploration leans too heavily toward being a traditional platformer due to its lack of having a truly interconnected world. Because of this, and the lack of combat challenge, Janosik 2 might not fully scratch the itch of die-hard Metroidvaniers. Janosik 2 smuggles its way into the C tier. Janosik 2 may not reinvent the Metroidvania wheel, but it certainly keeps it rolling. Its charming humor, whimsical nature, treasure-packed exploration, and old-school design make for a unique and fun experience that will rob you of your boredom.